as part of our series of reviewing different lab results, one of the common ones that we use a lot, and many people are familiar with it, is called Hemoglobin A1c. Now, this is the abbreviation for hemoglobin, HGB. Sometimes people use a different abbreviation, but hemoglobin is a protein. It consists of 4 different chains of proteins that are hooked together, and each of those chains has an iron atom in it inside a little molecule called heme. And so hemoglobin is a globin, which is a globular protein, that is a funny shaped bent protein that has a heme molecule in it, and inside the heme molecule is 1 atom of iron. And so a hemoglobin molecule has heme and globin, but it also has 4 chains like that hook together. So there are 4 hemoglobin molecules that hook together in what's called a tetramer. And so there are 4 heme molecules in every molecule of hemoglobin, and 4 iron atoms in every molecule of hemoglobin, and 4 globulin chains of protein inside every hemoglobin molecule. So inside the red blood corpuscle is where hemoglobin resides, and it's carried around in the blood, and its job is to have oxygen or carbon dioxide attached to it. So oxygen carries oxygen to the tissues and gives oxygen to the tissues, and then carbon dioxide, a waste product, is received from the tissues after they've done their metabolism, and then that's carried to the lungs and breathed out. So that's the purpose of hemoglobin. This, by the way, is the reason that carbon monoxide is poisonous, because carbon monoxide actually attaches to hemoglobin more tightly than oxygen does. So that means it displaces oxygen, and you have nicely saturated hemoglobin. It's got all the carbon dioxide in it, but it's not carrying oxygen. So you can have a wonderful oxygen saturation test, and yet you're suffocating because you don't have enough oxygen. So that's one of the things about hemoglobin physiology, basically, to understand. But one of the things that's interesting is that there are different types of hemoglobin. The main kind of adult hemoglobin is called hemoglobin adult. So we abbreviate it hemoglobin A. Most of hemoglobin A is type 1. There's a small amount of hemoglobin A2, that's sub 2, and that type is just less common, but it works the same way. And then there are some other hemoglobin types, such as hemoglobin F, which is fetal. Newborn babies have more of that, and of course before they're born they have more of that. And that changes the way oxygen and carbon dioxide are released so that they can tolerate the lack of oxygen that occurs during labor. So it helps them survive better. But then after they're born, gradually hemoglobin F is replaced by hemoglobin A. And in a matter of just a little while, babies will have adult hemoglobin, or hemoglobin A. And then there are abnormal hemoglobins such as hemoglobin D and hemoglobin E and hemoglobin S. Hemoglobin S is sickle cell disease. So these are genetic abnormalities of hemoglobin. But in hemoglobin of any kind, as hemoglobin sits in blood, some of it will become sugared. So as that glucose concentration goes up, then what we see is a higher percentage of hemoglobin A1c, the sugared hemoglobin. That's why this is a reasonable test to estimate the concentration of glucose in the blood. But this gives us an estimate of about 3 months of blood sugar. Well, that's an interesting thing. Why would it give us 3 months worth of information out of a single test? Well, the reason is that hemoglobin only works for a while. Pretty soon it gets old, and your body takes it out, retires it, and it gets replaced with new hemoglobin. So it's always being produced and always being destroyed. and the average life expectancy of a hemoglobin molecule is about 3 or 4 months. So when we talk about this A1C test, or hemoglobin A1C test, giving us 3 months worth of information, that's the reason that the 3 months is the duration of benefit for this test. But that also poses a little bit of a complication, and that is, what if, for one reason or another, the hemoglobin that I'm measuring is not as old as 3 months? Now, of course, some of the hemoglobin is going to be made today, and some of it will be 3 months old. So there's always going to be some hemoglobin that's younger, and there's probably going to be some hemoglobin that's older. But there are certain conditions that drastically increase the amount of new hemoglobin, or that might increase the amount of old hemoglobin. Well, if you have a higher percentage of new hemoglobin in the blood, then what that means is that hemoglobin has had less time to get sugared. And so then this will cause the A1C to be lower. Yet that lower A1C won't reflect the fact that the blood sugar is better. This A1C is better simply because the hemoglobin is newer or younger. So one of the things that is fairly common that can really confound the A1C is somebody that might have a chronic anemia. And when people have chronic anemia, many times they're replacing their hemoglobin at a little higher rate, or trying to. Their bone marrow is trying to get the hemoglobin back up. So that means they're always putting in newer hemoglobin. This artificially lowers the A1C, and it can be quite dramatic. You'll see people that really have very poor control of their diabetes, and if they had normally aged hemoglobin, it would perhaps give them an A1C of 10, which is really quite dreadful control of blood sugar. And yet, because they're anemic, their A1C is 6.2, which people interpret as doing very well. And so that test has some limitations. Another thing that can happen is someone who regularly donates blood. Well, if you go and donate blood and then you check your A1C 2 weeks later, it's going to be considerably lower than if you had checked it before the blood donation. So that doesn't give you very useful information. If you're a regular blood donor and you have diabetes and we're trying to monitor the degree of your blood sugar control, then if you go and donate blood and then 2 weeks later you get your A1C checked, it's going to make it look like your diabetes control is a great deal better than it really is. So for those of you who actually do donate blood, and thank you, by the way, for doing that, it would be good for you to do that right after you have gotten your A1C done, so that you've got a 3-month period of time so that the A1C the next time is a more reliable measure of how your blood sugar is doing. And then the other thing to think about is the opposite side of the coin, and that is, what if you've got some condition that causes your hemoglobin to be older? Well, there are multiple conditions that do that. One of them is hypothyroidism, or a tendency towards hypothyroidism. This means that the hemoglobin is being replaced at a lower rate because the bone marrow is hypothyroid. It's not running at its normal speed. Thyroid hormone adjusts the idle speed of every motor in your body, including the motors that run your bone marrow. And so if you've got a low idle speed in your bone marrow, you may be producing hemoglobin, well, you will be producing hemoglobin at a slower rate. So that means the hemoglobin that's new going into the blood is less. The body senses that and says, well, I guess I had better hold on to the hemoglobin that I have. I normally would retire it because it's kind of getting old, but I'll see if I can squeeze a little more time out of it. So then the hemoglobin that's already there lasts a little longer, and as a result, it's soaking in the sugar for a longer period of time, and accordingly, the A1c then is higher. But this doesn't necessarily mean that your glucose is any worse. So that would produce a false positive test. In other words, the test makes you look like your blood sugar is worse than it really is. So sometimes you have to combine the A1c together with regular blood sugar testing with a finger stick thing that you do multiple times at home. And I have had patients where these two pieces of data, the blood sugar record and the A1c, are quite dramatically different from each other. Well, then you have to explain that difference. And the way you do that is by investigating these kinds of issues. Have you donated blood lately? Have you had a bleeding episode, like you had really bad hemorrhoids or something like that and lost quite a bit of blood and then had to replace it? That sort of thing can really kind of mess things up. And so understanding the hemoglobin A1c and its limitations can be really helpful to understand not only about blood sugar control, but also about some other conditions. Because if you have a big difference between the blood sugar in general and the A1c, you might start searching for reasons why that could occur. And so even just that difference can give us some information that the test itself, all by itself, doesn't tell us. Thank you for listening to this learning module. We would welcome you to register on our website at healthcare.health and watch all the stuff that's there and search around and make yourself familiar with all of those resources.